In this video, I'm going to be talking about transformations within Photoshop. Transformations are what I like to call the movie magic of Photoshop because they can make your compositions look just that much better. What I mean by this is if your perspective is slightly off, or if you need to align or warp a rock to be more centered, or even if you need to push a branch off the edge of the photo, any of the tools I'm going to show you today can help make your photo that much better. So let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop and I'll show you where the transformation options are. All right, so if we load up Photoshop, we got our first image ready here. And you can see all the transformations under the edit options under this block right here. The first thing you're going to want to do before you create any transformations is duplicate the layer and convert it to a smart object. Essentially the same process you do with a filter. This is going to allow you to make and edit those transformations later on if you don't like them. So let's go ahead and duplicate this layer here and convert it into a smart object. Now, the first transformations I want to go over are these top 5 most basic ones up here. We'll start with scale, which is pretty self-explanatory. It just allows you to make your image bigger or smaller or transform it like that. If you like your option, you can go ahead and click the check mark up here. All right, let's go ahead and undo that. And let's go ahead and check out the second option, which is rotate. This one is even more self-explanatory. It's simply allow you to rotate your image. The next option here is skew, and this is where things start to get a little funky. We can go ahead and change the perspective like this by skewing it, as Photoshop calls it. The next option here, distort, is fairly similar to skew, but it will allow you to move your image a bit more in a 3D plane like this. The final transformation is called perspective, and this will allow you to change the perspective of your image in or out, make it closer, something along those lines there. So there's an easier way to use all those 5 individual tools, and that is through an option we call free transform. If you go up to edit up here, you can see free transform is right here. You can also access free transform by hitting Control T. So now we can go ahead and do all of those options at once depending on how we move it. See, we could rotate, and if you hold the control button down, you can now start to get into some of those more funky movements like perspective and skew and distort. So we're going to go ahead and fix this image up here because as you can see, the pier isn't perfectly straight. So let's go ahead and start by holding the control button and getting this perfectly straight with the wood at least. So now we have a solid wood line there, but now as you can see, the horizon isn't straight. So let's go ahead and hold control and move this up here a little bit and see if that's better. Let's go ahead and hit the check there. And since it's a smart object, if it's not what we like, we can always fix it later. Now that's looking pretty good, but I want to see if it's perfect. And one way to do that is to bring up these rulers on the edge right here. Now these aren't selected by default, and you could bring them up by going to View and selecting Rulers here. Once you have these rulers, you could simply drag down and create a line to see if it is straight. And that looks like it actually is straight. So to get rid of that line, we can now just drag this right back up with the Move tool and get rid of it. I think the main problem why this looks off is because it isn't perfectly centered. So let's go ahead and cut to the crop mode and see if we can get that more centered there. Notice how I'm aligning these points directly next to each other to make sure it is perfectly symmetrical. One tip with perspectives is you want perfect symmetry, and it will just click in the viewer's mind that much better if things are perfectly aligned. So I always like to bring out grids and really make sure things line up. This is also really applicable to churches or indoor spaces where you're shooting a full-on ceiling. So let's go ahead and click the OK there. And that's looking pretty good. Now we can go in and do our full edits. As you can see, we got like a center spot there and really turn this image into something more magical. The next tool I want to show you will be in this image right here. And we're going to be going over the content aware scale. Essentially, this tool allows you to scale and make your images bigger while simultaneously adding pixels and moving data around to what Photoshop would think is best. So for example, let's go ahead and crop this a little bigger here and see if Photoshop can scale this for us. So we're gonna click OK there. Now let's go up to the content aware scale. And you can unfortunately only do this option in a pixel layer because as we know, content aware only works with pixels. So let's click this option here. And now we can start to drag this bigger, and you're gonna see Photoshop's gonna fill in those gaps and move the clouds simultaneously to try and fit this image in a larger scale for us. So there we go. So the benefit of this is you're not stretching pixels, you're actually filling in more, which is keeping and maintaining the resolution. So that actually turned out looking really good here. Another point I want to make is that you can also use selections to move certain parts of your images. So let's go ahead and make a selection here of this mountain. So now what we can do is hit Control T, go to transform, and I could simply drag this mountain taller and make it look more epic. So let's go ahead and click like that and unselect, and now we have a taller mountain. So that's one way you can use the selection tool to help improve your transformations. Unfortunately, with the selection tool, it also won't work on smart objects, so you need to use those two examples of transformations on a pixel layer. Let's go ahead and hop to this image here where I want to go over the flip horizontal tool. You can click this and it will just go ahead and swap your whole image in the other direction. This is really great if you're stuck on an image and maybe you're not sure how it looks. It's also really beneficial to have your images going from left to right. So if you have an image like this where the main subject is coming out of the left, the human eye will naturally find this more appealing. So those flip tools can be really helpful. Vertical, obviously you wouldn't do this very often, but if you're working with an abstract shape or texture, then you might want to try this out. The next tool I want to go over is the warp tool, which is probably one of my favorite tools in Photoshop because it can allow you to do so much cool stuff to your photos. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean. So to access the warp tool, you go to transform and hit warp, or you can hit Control T and click on this button up here to enter the warp mode. Now you're gonna see this grid here that will allow you to make changes. So for example, if I drag this, I can now make that leaf a bit longer. And you're not only limited to that type of grid, you can make a smaller grid if you want, or you can make an even more detailed grid if you really want to get nitty-gritty with what you're transforming. One way I could work with this is to stretch this leaf out a bit, maybe make it a bit more curved. Maybe I want to flip this up a bit more and maybe twist that end a bit more. Maybe I want to stretch this out a bit, maybe not like that. And yeah, let's see what that looks like. So if we hit the check there, now you can see that that leaf is bigger and a bit more curled. So this tool is amazing for objects like that. You can also use this tool for bigger scenes. So let's check out this La Jolla image right here with this tide pool. So So let's go ahead and duplicate that layer and convert it to a smart object. Hit Control T and click this warp button here. So now we could warp, whoa, gotta be careful where you click. Sometimes things will get a bit nutty. So we can go ahead and warp some of these textures down here to make this tide pool a bit bigger, maybe make it a bit more abstract, and just have some fun with where these rocks and shapes are. Let's go ahead and stretch that out. Maybe we can pull this all down a little here, pull this tide pool closer to the edge, and something like that. So now, as you can see, we have a bit more of a 3D tide pool there. And if I wanted to go back and edit that again, I simply hit Control T, hop back into warp, and as you can see, everything is saved because it is a smart object. So those are the main transformation tools that I use. There's not a lot of them, but the ones that do exist have a ton of power to make your images amazing. Now there's two more tools up here that you might see and be curious about, and that's the puppet warp and the perspective warp. The puppet warp tool is more for humans, so you can pin points on humans and make it so that you can move their arms and legs around, quite literally like a puppet. I don't really have much use for this, but if you're doing more like quirky design stuff, then it could be useful. And the other tool here is the perspective warp tool, which is more beneficial for cityscapes. If you have a vanishing horizon line and you want to make sure your buildings are lined up straight, you can go ahead and use that tool to work with them. One thing I would also like to point out about transformations is it is beneficial to use them at the start of your workflow. I'd recommend getting your composition all lined up and set to how you want it with these transformations, and then going through and doing all the adjustments, layering, masking, dodging and burning, all that specific stuff later. So that is how I use transformations in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and hop to the next video.